Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Pleasure and honour to have a chance to talk to Stephen Cleobury. Stephen, where and when were you born?
I was born on the 31st of December 1948 in Bromley, Kent.
Why were you in Bromley, Kent? I mean, what were your parents doing there?
My father was a physician, he's still alive, and he was working at the General Hospital in Bromley, and my mother had been a nurse there. They married as a result of meeting there, and I think I'm right in saying that that's where I was born.
Sounds probable. What about your grandparents? Did you know your grandparents at all?
I knew both my maternal grandparents, who lived in Bromley. My maternal grandfather had worked in British ropes in the City of London. I'm not quite sure in what capacity, but they were among, I suppose, the early people to move out into developments, urban developments in Essex. And then my understanding is that Bromley, that part of South London, became a more desirable place to be, so they moved there, and he commuted from Bromley South Station to Holborn Viaduct on a daily basis. And my maternal grandmother was a housewife. She didn't work, she lived at home, ran the home. And in the case of my paternal grandparents, I can't remember whether I would ever have seen my grandmother, because she died early, but I have no recollection of ever having seen her. But I did know my paternal grandfather, and probably better because he was extremely interested in music. He'd worked in the Foreign Office originally. He used to tell me that he had been in an upper floor looking out of the window when Chamberlain returned with the famous piece of paper, and he observed this from the Foreign Office. But when his wife died young, he decided to become ordained as an Anglican priest. He'd been a lay reader in the church, and because he'd done his PhD externally, working at home in the evenings after his day at the Foreign Office, the bishop to whom he had to apply allowed him to be, as it were, fast-tracked. So I think his ordination training lasted about 2 years. And he was, as a matter of fact, a curate at St Luke's Church, Bromley, in Bromley Common. So the family was pretty closely centred on Bromley, and after a while my father became the junior partner in a practice, in the general practice. And the senior partner, who I assume, although I don't know, I assume now was the owner of the practice, chose not to live in the house. So we lived in fact quite a large house which contained the surgery, and a section of it was marked off for those professional purposes. And so yes, Bromley was quite the centre of things in those days.
Tell me about your parents. Were either of them musical or interested in music?
My father is extremely musical, and indeed had wanted to be a professional musician. But his father, I suppose this was a generational thing, thought that, I don't think his father would have thought that music was not a respectable profession, because he didn't hold those kind of views. In fact, he held quite strongly left-wing views, up to and including the point that he thought everybody should be paid the same salary and that there shouldn't be wage differentials. So he wouldn't have seen it, I think, as a matter of respectability, but he just thought that given the world as it was certainly going to be a very precarious profession, and so therefore my father was guided into an alternative profession, namely that of being a medical doctor. But he is very musical, and he plays the organ and the piano, and at various times in his life he experimented with other instruments. I remember the oboe and the viola as being things he dabbled with a bit. And he doesn't have, I mean, he's not academically trained in music, but he had a very high degree, or has a very high degree of natural musicality, and he's a very good sight reader and a good extemporizer, probably better than I am. My mother, not really trained in music, but enjoyed singing and was an amateur choral singer, played the piano a little bit, and later on in her life, for many years was secretary of the Kent County Music Festival and did a lot of work in the competitive festival and encouraging youngsters to be involved in music.
What was their characters, their personalities, and how that shaped you?
My mother is a great talker. And my father, by contrast, is rather quiet and understated and tends to listen while my mother is talking, but occasionally will come in with a pertinent and often rather humorous comment. But to me, they've been an example of what seems to me to be a nearly perfect marriage and relationship, deep love and respect for one another, which has been a great inspiration, I think.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I do. I have a younger brother, he's 18 months younger than I am, and he's a professional musician.
Nicholas,
Nicholas, yes.
Yeah.
And our sister Julia is about, let me see, she'd be about 3 or 4 years younger than Nicholas. And she's also a musician and a peripatetic teacher.
In Cambridge or around here?
No, this of course goes ahead a little bit in the chronological scheme of things, but my father, I've no doubt we'll come and talk about this, my father moved us all to Birmingham at a certain stage, and then he moved back down south to Canterbury, and in fact my brother and sister both moved there as well at various points, so there was quite a long period where I was the only member of the family resident other than in the environs of Canterbury. And my brother's now moved away, and Julia, my sister, continues to live there.
Tell me about your first school, if you remember it. Do you? Your pre-preparatory school?
Yes, I think that it might have been called Kerrywood. But I have no distinct memory of that. The earliest memories I have is going to a rather smart prep school called Bickley Park, which had a purple uniform.
Purple?
Yes. And
where was that?
Well, Bickley is a sort of next door place to Bromley. And it's a sort of smart end of Bromley. And memories of that, not very clear. One memory I do have is of playing rounders and being hit on the face with a bat or whatever you use in rounders, and I've still got a slight scar here where that happened, and I think that experience probably led to my distaste for playing games at later times in my life.
Which continued. You've never been a games
I'm not
person.
physically very courageous, and I think I had bad experiences of being made to play games at school.
Do you remember at Bickley Park whether music began to play any part in your life?
I don't think actually at the school, but I was sent at that time to a lady called Hilary Urquhart to have piano lessons. I should perhaps have mentioned that oddly, odd as it would seem today, at the age of about 6 or 7 I travelled to school on the bus, on my own, 2 bus journeys with a change in the centre of Bromley.
And not with any other children?
I suppose with my younger brother perhaps sometimes, but not in any organised way. It would be unthinkable today.
Absolutely.
And I think that gave one an independence that children perhaps aren't lucky enough to get. Now, so what I used to do on whatever afternoon of the week it was, instead of taking the 2 buses home, I would go to the piano lesson. I would then walk to my maternal grandmother's house where I would have tea and was rather spoiled. And then I went home later. And I think I was very lucky with the lessons I had then. She was a fine teacher. And I had an aunt on my father's side called Edith Lucas, who was also a piano teacher. She worked near Tunbridge. And I remember doing grade 1 piano and getting merit, pass with merit, which meant you got between 120 and 129 marks out of 150. And my aunt took the view that I should have got distinction. And the reason that I didn't was that I scored rather a low mark in sight reading. And she wrote me a letter and said that, this really won't do, and you've got to back up your sight reading. And I'm enormously grateful, have always been grateful for that, because it really did make me sit up and take that seriously, so that during my professional life I've regarded myself as being a reasonably good sight reader. So that was an early musical experience.
You got your grade 1 at about 6 or 7.
I suppose I must have done. Although my memory is vague now, I may be confusing years, it may have been a little bit, it may have been later. But I suppose the other musical experiences were at church, because naturally we attended St Luke's Church in Bromley Common. It was just down the road from where we lived, and my grandfather was curate there, and my father quite often used to play the organ. For example, he played the organ on Good Friday every year for the annual performance of Stainer's Crucifixion. He was good enough to do that. And we sang, I suppose, in the Sunday school, and that sort of thing.
And were you beginning to enjoy it? Some people found early church going pretty boring, but you were already beginning to enjoy music, at least.
Yes, I think probably I didn't go through that phase because I think music sort of took me through that. In fact, I've become more interested in the liturgical side of services later. So I think it was probably the music that took me through at that time.
So, discarding your purple uniform, where did you go next?
Well, the reason that we left Bickley Park was that my father took a change in the direction of his career. I believe that my brother and I had been put down to go to Tunbridge School, but we never went there because he decided that he wanted to leave general practice and become a psychiatrist. And when I look back on this, I think it must have been a very courageous decision, because he had 3 children under the age of 10, and obviously took a salary cut, and we were quite impoverished when we first moved to Birmingham. In fact, to begin with, we didn't have our own house. We lived in medical accommodation within the mental hospital at Rubery in southwest Birmingham, where he had his first post. Then we did eventually move into a house, and we were sent, my brother and I were sent to a school in Selly Oak for a term or 2. And this is an interesting part of the family history, because I think it was certainly the moment that changed the plans that my parents might have had in such a way as led to my doing what I'm now doing. Because a colleague of my father's, she was a spinster, I think she was a senior house officer, something like that, called Audra Roberts, who also resided in the hospital, rather took us under her wing, I imagine. I didn't realise at the time, but I imagine she was perhaps quite a lonely soul, and she befriended us and mothered us in a way, took us out for outings in the school holidays, that sort of thing. Anyway, she said to my parents, "Had you ever thought of a choir school education for your boys? Because there's Worcester just down the road, 25 miles, and you could get them a scholarship, and they could get a musical and otherwise good education there." And so Nicholas and I were taken, I remember, to Worcester. It must have been about, I should think, January 1958, something like that. And I remember going to have an audition with the then organist, Douglas Guest, whom I later realised had been the second organ scholar of King's in the 1930s. And David Wilcox, who came here as director of music in 1957, had just left Worcester. So I was the first, my brother and I were the first choristers to be selected by Douglas Guest. And as well as this musical interview, we had an academic interview, and we sat in desks in the nave of the cathedral, huddled round one of those old-fashioned stoves.
Like the one they've got in Ely.
That's right, yeah. Struggling to keep warm. At any rate, that's where we went, and that changed the whole course of things, really.
Your sister didn't go there, did she?
Well, she didn't, because these choirs were for boys only.
Yes, that's right.
She, in fact, and this is spooling on a bit, she did very well and got herself a scholarship at King Edward's Girls in Birmingham, and had a very good academic education in Birmingham.
So tell me a little about the choir school. I mean, were there any, in particular, any teachers or experiences there that were important for you? You were there for 5 years, were you? Or?
Well, it's a slightly different system operates at Worcester, or operated then, than does in the typical choir school, in that the King's School Worcester had a preparatory department, which was called St Albans, because it was located in a house called St Albans, and the choristers were educated there, but it wasn't just for the choristers. It was a school with other boarders and in fact some other day boys. And I think in the most general terms, I would have to say that my life focused on the cathedral and on the music much more than the school, really, at all times. So my happiest memories are located in the cathedral and with the music.
Is that a polite way of saying you had some unhappy memories? Because
yes.
A lot of the people I've interviewed talk with a mixture of anger and so on about their education and how unhappy they were and so on and so on, or how difficult it was.
If you were to talk to Emma, she would tell you that I tend to be given to understatement. And I think it's true to say that not every aspect of school life was happy.
You didn't play games, which was about stuff.
I didn't like playing games except cricket, which I liked but wasn't very good at. However, I don't think I'm angry about it.
Was it a boarding school?
It was. I mean, partly boarding and partly day, and I was a boarder.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm angry about it because, in a way, this was how things were. And it wasn't just this school that had these particular sort of things going on. I think even then, there was, looking back on it, I think there was incidentally, I mean, I think the children can be as nasty as the teachers. And I think that I was pilloried to some extent by my peers because they didn't share or understand my obsession with classical music. I think that was sort of fundamentally the problem. And there was, I mean, part of the thing in schools of that kind, well, and elsewhere, I suppose, in English society, there was a kind of anti-culturalism as well as anti-intellectualism, which we know about. And people, I think, just felt awkward about it because they didn't understand it. And this came out in, sort of manifested in various ways, sometimes quite hostile. And I think what that did for me was to make me very resilient and tough in terms of things that I've had to deal with in my adult life, which have been when I've had difficult things or situations to deal with. I think I've drawn the strength that I have from those early experiences. So to some extent, though they were unpleasant and unhappy things, they were, to use that old-fashioned term, character building.
That was the scheme to which I was subjected to. When you mentioned that some of your peers didn't really understand your interest and perhaps love of classical music, it sounds as if you had that love early on.
Yes.
How old were you when you began to
Oh, really quite young, because I mean the music that we would have heard at home was all from that.
Because I remember more as the moment, when I was about 14 or 15, when someone played me Dvorak, and I realised that this was a new world. But you were 6 or 7, perhaps, or younger, when you started to.
Yes, I think one didn't sort of quite think of it like that at that age. I mean, one thing I could pinpoint was, I think, when I was about 12, singing in the Three Choirs Festival at Worcester in a performance of Verdi's Te Deum. And there's a wonderful melody, or a number of wonderful melodies in that, but one which particularly seemed to stir me. And at that point, I remember thinking, I think I'd like to spend my life with music. Of course, not having any idea what the implications were of becoming a professional musician. But I think even before that, I was responding emotionally as well as intellectually to music. I mean, often things now that I would find quite surprising, like hymn tunes and that sort of thing. And I think one does respond in different ways to different things at different stages in life. I mean, you have an obsession with a particular composer or a particular piece, and then 30 years later you look back on it and you wonder why you did, because you come on to other things. And then you come back to things as well.
What age did the school go up to? Was it a...
Well, I should have completed what I said earlier. We didn't have to do an exam to go on to another school. We simply went through from St Albans, the prep school, into the main school, the King's School Worcester. We did have to take the 11 plus, but I mean it was pretty much a formality that one went through. I mean, when I look at our choristers at King's today, and I see all the pressures which surround them at age 13 having to do the common entrance to get a music scholarship, and the pressures that are put upon them, not least by their parents in some cases, I feel rather sorry for them, although they're getting actually a better all-round musical education than I had.
So this school took you right through to 17, 18?
Yes.
And during the whole course of that, were there any music or other teachers who you remember as inspiring you in any way? Or
yes,
not?
I do. The system was that it was an advantage to the choir, because here at King's, when a boy is 13 and a half, regardless of whether his voice has changed, he has to leave and go on somewhere else. Whereas with the arrangement we had at Worcester, I was able to stay on in the choir until I was around 14 and a half. And let me see, to answer your question, I was extremely fortunate in having two very inspiring and dedicated teachers on the music side. There was a 19th century organist at Worcester Cathedral called William Doane, who left money to enable former choristers to receive free musical instrumental tuition. So I was awarded this actually in my last year in the choir, and Douglas Guest started me on organ lessons and cymbal lessons in harmony. And then he was succeeded in 1963 by Christopher Robinson, who brought with him as an assistant Harry Brammer, and they were just fantastic teachers. And the evidence for that is not necessarily that they produced me as a pupil, but that there were about 6 or 8 of us who, towards the end of the 60s, were winning major organ scholarships to Oxbridge colleges. And so it wasn't the case that this was a school which was necessarily attracting lots and lots of musical people, because the quality of music in the school, until Harry Brammer was appointed to be the director of music and transformed it, the quality was rather poor and low, so what we got was some of the people connected with the cathedral. So Christopher taught me the organ and the piano, and Harry dealt with the academic side of my musical education O&A level. There were no formal O&A level classes timetabled in the school, and we did them out of school. We used to go to Harry's house after school at 4 o'clock on a couple of afternoons a week, and he used to put, I suppose it would have been a 10-shilling note or something like that, into our hands, send us down to the local cake shop, and he would brew the tea, and we'd come back and do our harmony or our analysis or whatever it was. And he really was dedicated to getting us interested in good music. He just recently bought a new, what we would now call on hi-fi, and I remember he himself was so enthusiastic. He said, I've just bought all the Mozart piano concertos, or the Haydn string quartets, or Wagner's The Ring. I remember being introduced to Siegfried by him, for example. And so we were enormously lucky. There was a gap, there was a major gap in what the school provided, which was there was no orchestral activity. And it was only later that I learnt to play the viola a little bit, but never had the opportunity properly of playing in an orchestra, which I've deeply regretted ever since. But everything else about that was great. But there were also some teachers in the school who were passionate about music. I remember actually 2 of the classics teachers. A man called Ken Barnett, who was a great lover of Mozart, and I fell in love with things like the clarinet concerto at that time and would talk to him about them. And there was another called Tony Cleobury who'd actually read classics at King's, I later discovered. He was hugely interested in music. So there were musical people about, but the actual musical tradition in the school at that time was pretty non-existent.
Were you doing other, I mean, you must have been doing other subjects like classics and so on. Were you interested in any of them particularly?
Yes. I'm told that I was quite good at maths, and I was certainly in the top set for maths and used to come third. There were 2 others who were very good at maths whom I could never beat. And we were advanced to the extent that we did O-level a year early, and those of us who'd done that then went on to do, I think it was called additional maths O-level or something like that. And the teacher we had, a man called Richard Knight, who was, I think, had been passed out as a wrangler in Cambridge when he was here, was working on a new book about new ways and styles of teaching mathematics, and we had opportunity to use what must have been very crude and early calculators. In my memory of them, they're more like cash registers. But so that was interesting, and I gather that when it came to the time to choose A-level subjects, that there was a little bit of an argument in the common room about what I might do, because the mathematicians wanted me to do maths and further maths, and I wanted to do languages, because by that time I was clear enough about my desire to do music, and I thought it would be useful to have some sort of command of French and German, which were the options then, rather than continuing with maths. So that's in fact what I did. I was always interested in the classics, but not very good at it.
Were there any other things that you remember which you might call hobbies? I mean, normally I talk about music, but that clearly was important. Did you read novels? Did you like poetry? Did you?
I was no. Well, I mean, I did a bit, but I was not a good reader when I was young. I was very interested in cricket, and I read books about cricket, and I was interested in chess, and I played for the school first six or whatever they had in chess. And at Worcester, of course, we had a wonderful cricket ground, so on the half-day, Wednesday half-day, I would go to see whatever cricket was available. My father used to get us a junior membership, so for 10 and sixpence you could go to any match you liked. And so I did all that, and I used to enjoy reading newspapers, and I was interested in politics, although the politics that I held then probably would I've been ashamed to admit now. But I was not a good reader, and I mean, I always hesitate to blame teachers, because I rather hold to the old-fashioned view that students should make an effort as well. But I think, to be honest, the English teaching that I had was not terrifically inspired, and it probably turned me off a bit. I mean, spooling on, now I hugely regret that, and I take whatever opportunity I can, which isn't very much, to try and repair the omissions, because I absolutely love it now to be able to read novels and poetry, and I sort of find myself wishing I wasn't so busy and I had more time. But then I didn't, that was a misspent youth in that respect. But of course music was also in a sense a hobby, because I enjoyed listening to all kinds of music as well as the music that I was doing.
You mentioned politics then, of a kind which you might not appreciate looking back on.
Yes.
But did you remain interested in politics, and what are your political views now? And
well, I was very interested in politics, but it was a sort of party politics of the day, and it wasn't a kind of academic approach to politics. And I did run as the school Conservative candidate in the general election of 1966. And I remember being able to get Peter Walker, who now, of course, Lord Walker, was a cabinet minister.
Yeah.
He was then the MP for Worcester, and he came and spoke in my support. Funnily enough, I met him just a few months ago at the Carlton Club. I was having dinner there as a guest, I'm not a member. And he had been, or is, chairman of the Carlton Club. He came in and I reminded him of this event. And he said, well, you must have done very well to win, despite my support. Yes, so I was interested, and I did remain interested, and still am interested, but I don't have time to follow it so closely. And I was also a bit of a sort of nerd in that I used to pore over Whitaker's almanac, and I could probably have told you the names of the MPs for most constituencies, and in some cases the size of their majority and the swing and all. I was quite interested, really quite interested in that. Over the years, my general political stance has moved to the left, which I think is probably not common. I think most people that I've met seem to move to the right as they get older, but maybe I started too far to the right to hold that position.
Now where would you put yourself, in the middle or slightly to the left of the middle?
Well, I'm now at the stage where I would find it difficult to put a cross against any of the political parties, really, because it seems to me none of them, for me now, has a totally convincing position. But I think that well, a great hero of my earlier life was Ted Heath, and I did get to know him later on because of his musical interests. I got to know him a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. Met him on a few occasions. And I was very, I suppose the strongest commitment I've ever had in intellectual terms to a political position would be the so-called One Nation Toryism, where you accepted that to have a successful and buoyant economy you needed to have free enterprise, but you also had to make sure that society felt and carried out a responsibility to look after people who couldn't float in that. So I suppose, and to some extent I think that is probably my basic outlook. And I'm just not sure that there's anybody at the moment that kind of reflects that position. I think today a lot of my instincts would be with the Liberal Democrats. I'm pro-European. I think they were the only one of the major political parties to speak out about Iraq. On the other hand, I'm quite a libertarian in that I believe in my right to send my child to an independent school if I want to, because if, somebody might want to buy a Jaguar or go have a house in France or buy expensive holidays. So I think with such money as I can earn, I believe I should be free to dispose of it as I wish.
Okay, well let's move on to that. You then went on to university, or
Yes.
after? Did you apply to several places, or
No, I applied to St John's College, Cambridge, and was appointed.
because there was
student.
a musical theme there, or why did you?
Yes, well, there was a friend of the family's who was a professional musician who visited the house very often and was friends with my parents. And he'd been a choral scholar at St John's, and he knew a lot of the Cambridge people from that time, and he advised my parents, who were not knowledgeable about this scene at all, and of course I was advised by Christopher Robinson and Harry Brammer, whom I've earlier mentioned, who themselves were Oxbridge graduates. Christopher had been at Christ Church and Harry at Pembroke, so they knew the scene. And one found out which were the colleges which were offering scholarships, and of course St John's and King's at that time were preeminent, really. I mean, in more recent years there have been certainly chorally speaking, great rise in standards of singing in many of the colleges, particularly since the advent of mixed choirs. But at that time, St John's and King's would have been seen as the height, and that was where I went, to St John's.
You get a musical scholarship?
I got an organ scholarship.
Was your undergraduate time happy?
Yes. I think that as you go through, or my experience was, as you go through life, there are periods when you sort of feel liberated from what you've been doing. And I remember the first of those was when I went into the sixth form, because to some extent it was easier then to follow one's own enthusiasms and what one wanted to do, and I became less concerned about what other people thought. And then coming to Cambridge was another liberating, and I felt enormously liberated, because I felt for the first time that I was allowed to indulge myself in music in a way which would be respected even by people who weren't themselves musicians. I felt it was sort of legitimate.
Did you come up to read music, or?
Yes.
Yeah. And were there any teachers at that stage or lecturers or anyone else who you particularly remember and influenced you?
Well, of course, I worked very closely with the late George Guest, who was director of music at St John's, and who was a legendary figure in his lifetime, it's true to say. I mean, he St John's was his life's work. He'd never really done anything else. He came himself to St John's as organ scholar. He went into research. He was doing research, I think, into Fairfax or composer that era, and within a year or so of his having started that, Robin Orr, who was then organist at St John's, was appointed to the chair in Glasgow, and the college invited George to become organist there and then. And in those days you didn't have to advertise things or anything like that. And so he was just a natural person. And he was a great inspiration. I mean, from a technical point of view, there were criticisms I can now see that one could have made.
Yeah.
But music came out of every pore, and he was possessed of enormous natural musicianship. He could sit down on a piano and improvise and play jazz, sidebeat things, and everything he did, he made extremely musical and expressive, and this is how he dealt with the choir. So that was a great influence, and he was quite a tough taskmaster, and he, like Christopher, taught me lots of things that I now use on a daily basis to my great benefit. And I came across David Wilcox also, who was partly disposed to be interested in me because of the Worcester connection. And
was David at King's by then, or not?
Yes, he was, yes.
Yeah.
This was 1967, so David would have been here 10 years as director of music. And he very kindly said, well, if you ever want to come up into the organ loft at King's, do feel very free to do so. And because Evensong here at King's on a Sunday is at 3:30 and at John's at 6:30, this meant that I could come on a Sunday afternoon, which I did quite often. And I played for him as the rehearsal accompanist for the COMS chorus every Friday night. And he could be quite terrifying. I mean, I remember the first rehearsal I played for was of the B minor Mass, the Bach B minor Mass. And he said, right, we're going to start with the Gloria. And the Gloria begins with a long instrumental ritornello. And I had to play this on the piano. He didn't introduce me or anything, he just made me play this. And got to the end, the first chorus entry, he said, thank you very much, I'm now going to introduce our new accompanist, Stephen Cleobury. But I wanted you all to hear that he could play well before I did so. And yes, he was a tough taskmaster as well, but one needs that. And then in the other teachers, I remember, I suppose first and foremost, Peter Hure, who was a fellow of Cats, and one of the last, I suppose, of the generation of bona fide musicologists who ranged quite widely. I mean, in these days of greater and greater specialisation, you don't find that kind of person so very often. No, and I imagine that's true over the whole spectrum of academia. So he was very good on early English music. He taught me phonotation, and he gave me, I think, great insights into intellectual perception and appreciation of music. And I really valued the academic, doing music academically as well, because not that I've become an academic in music, but I think that what I learnt at that time, and through doing the Busby and paleography and musical criticism and that kind of thing, has, I like to think, has informed my approach to performing music, which is what I basically do.
So you read music for 3 years, or did they?
3 years, and then I did a 4th year at Busby.
Ah, right. What, by this time, I mean, as you say, one's love of different composers and types of music change over time, but do you remember what it was that really you loved most when you were an undergraduate? Music? Was it orchestral? Was it Mozart? Was it?
Well, I had a number of quite significant musical epiphanies, I suppose you could say.
Yes, good. Tell us about them.
At that time. I remember, for example, here George Guest was very interested in music of the Roman Church and had visited Spain and was a great devotee of George Malcolm, who'd done enormous work in bringing Gregorian chant and Renaissance polyphony into the repertoire at Westminster Cathedral. George was a great devotee of all that and copied a lot of that. So the St John's Choir at that time was probably the only Anglican choir singing any significant amount of Gregorian chant. And I remember finding that inexpressibly beautiful when I first heard it. And he did it with probably what nowadays would be thought of a deeply inauthentic way, but it was a very beautiful musical experience. And that was one thing. I remember going to have tea with, because in those days there was time to go and have tea with people. I went to have tea with a friend of mine who was Organ Scholar at Jesus College, called Terry Albright, who had just bought a recording of Messiaen's Turangalila Symphony. And he said, hey, listen to this. And we listened to the movement called Joy of the Star's Blood, and one or two of the sort of love song movements. And I got tremendously excited by that and went off and learnt a lot of organ music by Messiaen, which resulted, for example, in my doing my first, I've done it 3 or 4 times since, but a complete performance of Messiaen's La Nativité du Seigneur, which plays for about an hour. And so that was another enthusiasm. I got very enthusiastic about opera. In those days, the Guildhall Opera used to have a little run at the Arts Theatre. I saw, I can remember particularly Verdi's Falstaff. And I did get involved in the QOS myself and conducted 1 or 2 productions. We had also visiting orchestras. I remember going to hear Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique in the cinema up opposite Emmanuel College, conducted by Norman Del Mar. So there were lots of experiences to add to what I'd had at Worcester, which was mostly liturgical and the major choral works. I mean, I'd experienced things like The Dream of Gerontius and Mendelssohn's Elijah, all those sort of things, but this widened it out.
Did you already sense that Cambridge was a place filled with music, that there was a lot of opportunity for different kinds of musical experience?
I didn't really know that before I came here, but I pretty soon realised.
That it was, and it is.
And
still.
it remains so. Yes,
Yes.
I mean, arguably too much going on.
Why too much? How can you have too much?
Well, in the sense that there seems to me to be a superfluity of student musical activity which doesn't always yield performances of the highest quality. And I would prefer, but then it's a free market, if you like, so
Yes.
they can order what they like, and that's great because the cream eventually rises to the top. But in some ways I prefer to see fewer performances of higher quality.
But the experience of doing it for them is
Quite invaluable. And it's a complete difference. I mean, in recent years I've done some workshop masterclass type things on conducting, for example in America, where they have a much more organised pedagogical system of instructing students in conducting. But in fact, you can devise all sorts of courses and you can get people up to a certain level, but unless there's a natural talent and musicality there as well, they're not going to make it to the topmost rung. Whereas here we're much more dilettante about it, and the great thing about Cambridge is that people, as you say, had these opportunities and the cream rose to the top. I mean, people just around my time, like Richard Hickox, or people a bit older than I am, Andrew Davis, Mark Elder, David Atherton, all these people cut their teeth in the undergraduate musical world in Cambridge. So and it remains so to this day, I should say.
You mentioned those well-known names. Are there, if you had to think of really first-rate musicians you've known coming up through Cambridge, are there any others apart from the ones you mentioned? Well, there probably are, but it's...
Well, I think that at any one time there's usually a few. I mean, here in King's, I suppose among the most recent examples is Thomas Addis, composer, and more closely connected with me are some of our oral scholars who've gone on to have very successful careers. So there are always people around. That's part of why it's such a stimulating place to be in.
But could you stay here? That's the question. What happened at the end of your 4 years?
I was appointed to, I did 2 or 3 different jobs in Northampton. The principal reason for going there was to be organist of the Church of St Matthew's, which is on the east side of Northampton. It was one of these churches that was built at the end of the 19th century when the church was expanding, the population was expanding in the suburbs of the town, and it was a very lavishly built church with a 4-manual organ, made possible to some extent by money put up by the local brewery, the name of which I currently forget. It was subsequently taken over by Watley Man. I remember that because my assistant organist was the company secretary of Watley Man and provided us liberally with appropriate refreshments at the annual choir party. So I did that, and that was a men and boys choir, voluntary choir, completely different from anything else I'd experienced before. Local children, some of whom came from quite poor families, whom I had to recruit. There was no choir school, anything like that. So whether they came or not depended upon whether they liked it when they came, and recruiting men as well. And the church was musically, or is musically, quite distinguished because one of the early incumbents had been a man called Walter Hussey, who later became Dean of Chichester, and he was a great patron of the arts. He was a very wealthy man in his own right, and he had the ability to spot talented people in the arts at a young age. So he had commissioned Benjamin Britten, he had commissioned Graham Sutherland and Henry Moore, who were all at early stages in their career when it was reasonably affordable. And there was a wonderful Graham Sutherland crucifixion behind the altar, which I think must have been some sort of a model for what he eventually did for the restored Coventry Cathedral. There was a Henry Moore Madonna and Child, and Britain's cantata Rejoice in the Lamb, which is very often performed today. We often perform here. So the church had a musical tradition, but our forebears had failed to endow it. So, like many churches, you know, they were stuck with a very large building and they couldn't afford to heat it properly, or you know, all that sort of thing. But I mean, that paid very little money. So I was also appointed, and it's amazing to think of this now, because I had no teacher training experience and no previous teaching experience. I was appointed director of music at Northampton Grammar School, and that was very hard work, because I mean, it wasn't a natural. I mean, I didn't really know what I was doing, I suppose. I enjoyed teaching very much O and A level because I suppose I still had it fresh in my mind. I'd done it myself, and of course I had all the stuff from the tripos fresh in my mind. So I found it easy to do, and the classes were small, and the people who were in them because they had made a definite decision that they wanted to do music O level or music A level. Whereas I found the so-called class music teaching really a challenge, because although I myself you know, am deeply motivated by and committed to music, I don't have, or I didn't then have, a strongly kind of evangelical outlook on it. I didn't think it was my job, and certainly I wasn't good at trying to enthuse other people about it. And I mean, I shudder to think now of the things I used to say to adolescents in the C stream, you know, about how it was rather pompously, I suppose I must have said something like, you know, how it was important for any educated person to know something about Beethoven. That didn't play too well. And I also conducted the local Bach choir, which was an amateur chorus, which brought me also into contact with conducting the local amateur orchestras, and I had a chamber choir. And I think, apart from the last 10 or 15 years that I've had here at King's, when I've also been working with the BBC Singers to some extent, I don't think I've ever been busier in my whole life in terms of the number of hours a week I was working. But to go back to what I said about the church, I mean, it was a completely different experience from what I now see was a rather cloistered existence up to then. I mean, I'd been at Worcester, and then at St John's, and these were choirs that were operating at a very high level, and here I was at the coalface. But I remember talking to Douglas Guest about it, who'd been my choir master at Worcester, and who will appear in our story in a few minutes when we go on again. And he used what I gather is an army expression. He said, it's a really good thing for your boy to go get your knees brown. And although I found it in many ways frustrating, as every year has passed since, I've been more and more grateful in many ways, not in every way, but in many ways that I did it, because it's given me a widened perspective.
But you didn't do it for, how long did you do it?
3 or 4 years.
And then...
And I remember after the end of the second year, I received a certificate through the post to say that I was now a qualified teacher.
Those were the
I'd
days.
done no training, and nobody, as far as I was aware, unless they were hiding in a cupboard, nobody had ever been to observe me in the classroom. We had a very good headmaster there who was very old school. I mean, he never came in the common room. We sat in his office all day. He had these lights outside his door. You went to see him, it would either say red, go where I'm busy, or yellow, wait, or green, come in. And no Christian names. But he got all the new teachers together the first day I was there, and said, no, I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that some school children behave badly. So if you have trouble, I will always support you. He said, I might tell you that you should have handled it differently or do it like that next time, but I'll always support you. And that was great. So that sort of helped to get me through, really.
Where did you go after?
I went to Westminster Abbey.
Ah, right.
Now this might sound a bit, well, I mean, these days it might sound a bit odd, but Douglas Guest, who'd been my choir master at Worcester, was the organist at Westminster Abbey then, and he obviously wanted me to come to be the sub-organist. And I mean, I went through a proper application and interview process, but clearly his influence was strong, and I was the sub-organist there for another 3 or 4 years.
And how was that?
Well, it was a bit of a curate's egg, because obviously the Abbey side of it was very challenging and very stimulating. I came back, of course, into the world of high-quality choral singing and had my first experience of dealing with professional singers. And so I had to find out how to work at that level and how to gain their respect. And I do remember the first week I was there, I'd been given responsibility for being in charge of all the services which involved just the lay clerks, as they were called, the lay vicars, the professional singers. So when the boys were on holiday, I had to do all these services. And things had obviously got a bit slack. And I found that when I arrived at the beginning of the rehearsal, people weren't necessarily ready to start, and so on and so forth. So I waited until the first Sunday when they were all there. And I said, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be approaching this thing rigorously, and when it's the time for rehearsal, I expect you to be there, and we're going to do the job properly. And looking back on it, I mean, that was an extraordinarily courageous thing to do. And one of the senior lay vicars came to me afterwards and said, we recognise that took great courage, and we admire you for that, and we're going to do our stuff. So that was another sort of very important bit of my learning experience. And we had these great state occasions. The first service I played for in the Abbey, I think, was the memorial service for the Duke of Gloucester. And we would have regularly services at which the Queen or members of the royal family would be there, or the services, or the sort of political elite, and so on and so forth. So there were interesting occasions, although in some ways they had their amusing side, because it could be frightfully pompous. And there were good people there who were friendly, but the actual nature of the job was, I would go as far as to say, unsatisfactory, because you had to be there when it suited them to want you to be there, like when the boys were on holiday, or if the organist was ill. But in fact, it was, other than that, it was a part-time job, so I really had to do other freelance things to earn a living. And so ultimately I found that was not entirely satisfactory, because you couldn't take a regular job, because suddenly you might be called because the organist was ill, or you had to be there because the boys were absent, so you had to do very much piecemeal things. But I had to give a weekly organ recital every Sunday evening for half an hour, and repertoire at my fingertips, as in those days.
And after that?
After that, I moved down Victoria Street to Westminster Cathedral, where I became Master of the Music. And in fact, all these moves are slightly surprising, had you asked me to predict at the age of 20, I would never have said that. And that was mildly controversial, because I was an Anglican, and here I was being invited to run the music at the principal Roman Catholic cathedral in this country. But the great thing there was the recent arrival of Basil Hume to be Archbishop of Westminster. And the thing that the musical tradition there, as I've mentioned earlier, was it was a great tradition. In fact, the first Master of Music at Westminster Cathedral, Richard Terry, had sung in the choir at King's in the 1890s as a lay clerk or something like that. He was an Anglican then, and then he became a convert to the Roman Church. I think taught at Downside. He was very much involved in editing Renaissance polyphony from the Continent, Palestrina, Lassus, and so on. And however, if you listen to, there are one or two very early recordings of the Westminster Cathedral Choir, and they sound pretty much like the Anglican choirs. But George Malcolm transformed that, and there'd been a great musical tradition there. But things had just got temporarily difficult. I think the priests were trying to come to terms with the Second Vatican Council and the aftermath of it. There were issues about the appropriateness, therefore, of having a robed and professional choir singing the services, because there'd been so much talk about involving the congregation in participating in the services more vocally, and of course it was costly, and was this the right use of money, and all he said there were really quite difficult issues they were grappling with. And I think had Basil Hume not arrived, it might well have just gone down the plug. But one of the first things he did was to reverse all this and say, we're going to have a choir, and we're going to make it function well. And he reconstituted the school governors and appointed really excellent people to the council, got that going. And he got all the sort of senior Catholic hierarchy, from the Duke of Norfolk downwards, around the table and said, now this is what we're going to do, and you're going to go and find the money for it. The Catholic Church is much better than the Anglican Church at doing that. And that they did. What they didn't do, as a matter of fact, was to safeguard the professional singers and the means of financing that, but that's another story. Yes, so I went there. It was mildly controversial. A few people wrote letters to the paper and said this is absolutely disgraceful, so on and so forth. But Hume, I was told later, said that he'd rather have a practicing Anglican than a lapsed Catholic rather than music at his cathedral. He was a great inspiration. He was not a great manager, or he didn't have any kind of very much business sense or anything like that, but he was a man of deep humanity, and the few times that I went to see him about professional things, I just came out of the room feeling completely different. Completely, he had this extraordinary way of stopping you feeling angry about things. I mean, the reason that I would have gone to see him is I was worked up about something, and he just had the ability to diffuse that. He was a great inspiration, and I had a wonderful time there, musically. There were frustrating things about dealing with some of the priests, but then that's a common occurrence in church music circles. There's a story, I think it's told on both sides, that priests say to each other, what's the difference between an organist and a terrorist? And the answer is, you can negotiate with a terrorist.
Can we just interrupt for a moment? You said better a practicing Anglican than a lapsed Catholic, according to Hume. Religion has sort of come in and out of your life, and I wondered, it's always very interesting to hear what people's beliefs are, but like tastes in music, they change over time. But how would you describe your...
Not something I ever talked about very much.
No, well, I can tell you the scientists have talked about it even less.
Right. Well, as you've heard, I mean, I was born into a family in which my grandfather was an Anglican priest, my father played organ in the church, and of course I assumed that my father adhered to all these beliefs, and in recent years, when I talked to him more about it, I found that in fact he doesn't really, because a lot of his scientific training and his work as a doctor has made it difficult for him. My mother is, I think, much more kind of natural believer. She has strong religious beliefs and reads her Bible, has a prayer book by her side and that sort of thing. And I suppose I was quite devout when I was young. I was confirmed. I remember being told by the bishop who confirmed me, I suppose I was 15, something like that. He said, well, don't worry, by the time you're 18 you'll be an atheist. And I was deeply shocked by that. I said, what a terrible thing to say when you've just confirmed something. And I think there were times when I actually became, really quite involved. I remember reading and struggling my way right through Hans Kuhn's book, Does God Exist? Or I've forgotten if that's the actual title of it, but something like that. And so I could be deeply immersed in it. And my grandfather also wrote about natural philosophy. And it was a bit of a joke in the family that none of us could really understand the books, but I did try to read some of them. So I was interested in all that, and of course, in the course of my professional life, I've heard more sermons probably than I've had hot dinners. And I've also met some really inspiring clergy. I have to say, for various personal reasons, in recent years, that has rather cooled.
When you said you appreciated the liturgical side of music more, to me, without really checking it, liturgy is something to do with theology and religion as well, isn't it? Or is it the ritual side of it?
Yeah, I think the ritual side is very important. I think you touch on an interesting question here, because when I went to Westminster Cathedral, a lot of my friends say, you must be crazy, you'll be there a couple of weeks and they'll be trying to convert you to the Holy Roman Church and all this sort of thing. And as a matter of fact, they never did. They were punctilious about that. But I did become rather deeply in love with the liturgy. And I think actually that quite a lot of atheists whom I know love the old liturgy. And in fact, I don't know what Tony Tanner's religious standpoint was, but I'm sure he wasn't a traditional...
He was an agnostic.
Yeah. Well, I remember him...
At least.
We had a dean here, in the middle of my time here, who decided on one occasion to use a different Bible translation from the authorised version, which we're accustomed to having in chapel. And Tony was there, and he wrote to the provost at the time, said, would he please instruct the dean to cease the use of teabag English in the chapel. And so I think there's something important about the ritual, and the Roman Catholic liturgy, it has an enormously strong feeling of rhythm and beautifully designed. I mean, it's almost a work of art. You know, the office of the various offices and the way they progress through the Christian year. And at least for me, musically, to have come face to face with that and begun to understand it has, I think, deepened my appreciation of liturgical music, at least that from the Renaissance, which was very strongly based in the old monastic liturgies. Nowadays, for various reasons, which I'd rather not go into, it's become more difficult for me.
I'm not sure I can put this question quite, but talking to a lot of the mathematicians, they take rather a view which Einstein took, which is that the more they do their advanced science, the more they have a sense behind this material, physical world of something inexplicable,
Yes.
beautiful, wondrous.
Yes.
And I've always found music brings me closer to that than almost anything else, except perhaps poetry.
Yeah.
Do you feel, as you are practicing your music, that although it's not religious in the formal sense of the word religious, there is a sense that you are touching something, particularly in obviously the works of people like Bach and others, which is akin to a religious sentiment?
Yes, I mean, I think I'd have to think rather carefully before being able to be very cogent about this, but I think, I mean, in the days when I was really a committed and unquestioning believer, I would have said, perhaps rather patronisingly, of those who didn't subscribe to that in fact anybody who is able to have these kind of feelings that you've been discussing is in fact experiencing God, but they're not calling it God, or they're not recognising it as that. So I think where I am now is that it's undoubtedly the case, and I've met and heard lots of scientists talking about this, it's undoubtedly the case that many of them, and many of us, myself included, have these kind of experiences and senses in connection with music or poetry or painting or whatever it might be. And what I'm just not so sure about now is actually what that is, and what to call it, but it's there. And I think it's more I certainly think one of the great mysteries for me is how do you explain the effect that the music of Bach has on you. I mean, it undoubtedly does, but how do you explain that in words? Very difficult. But I like in recent years I've read and indeed come to know a little bit Don Cupid,
Yes.
who was rather a sort of enfant terrible in the church. In fact, Ely Cathedral, I believe, will no longer sell his books at their store.
Really? Gosh.
But he has this idea, what I think he calls the sea of faith. He has this sort of idea that God is kind of in and around, and I quite like that. It's kind of, and I got much keener on the idea of the Holy Spirit than God the Father and God the Son, because that idea of there being some sort of thing that's around in the air is appealing to me. Whatever you think it's called, and whatever value it has for you.
It's more Eastern, more Japanese, more Zen, more Buddhist.
And I've used this, tried to develop this idea when I've been challenged by people. An undergraduate came to interview me earlier this year for varsity, and he was obviously a budding journalist, because he had clearly decided what he was going to say in the article before he spoke, and no matter what I said was not going to change. But his basic thesis was that the services in King's College Chapel were really not especially valid as services, because they were basically concerts put on for the benefit of tourists. And that's the extreme view. And I simply don't accept that. And what I see that we're doing is to, if you like, to go back to what we were saying a moment ago, we're engaging in something which is okay, repetitive and ritual, but which is so rich in what it offers that it enables an extraordinarily wide spectrum of people to go in there and gain what they can gain from it. So you can, I hope, cater for the traditional, as it were, card-carrying Christian who wants a legitimate liturgical experience, but yet you might get somebody who's company only time in their life. You might get an agnostic or an atheist or a Buddhist or whoever it is. And one of the things that sustains me in what I'm doing there every day is that if one person who's come that day is enriched by that experience, then in some way it's been worth it. Quite apart from the fact that I happen to think we're enriching the lives of the members of the choir and so on and so forth, but that's another subject altogether.
I'm not doing these in sequence, but they're sort of leading on. What can you describe what it's like to be the choir master in King's College Chapel? With this wonderful choir.
When I first came, I was really terrified of it, because I stood in great awe of the tradition and doubted my ability to be able to continue it, and was very conscious of the very high expectations that people had. Bernard Williams was a huge support to me, but of course in his typical way, I remember he asked me to come and see him shortly after I'd arrived. He said, I perhaps need to tell you that not many fellows come to the chapel, so don't be too disappointed about that. But he said they collectively they deeply value it, and are in fact very jealous of its reputation, and you'll soon hear from them that they don't like what's going on.
Made you even more terrified.
Well, it did a bit, but he was enormously supportive. He wasn't, you never got anything mechanical, or, he didn't say things for the sake of it. Occasionally a little note would arrive and say, I enjoyed that very much, or it went very well, or come and talk to me. And I remember at the end of my first term, he asked me to go and see him and said, I think you should talk to the cornerstones more. Tell them what you think of what they're doing. He was just very discreetly in the background, helping me along. And after about 5 years, I decided that I'd do better if I tried to be myself, instead of looking over my shoulder and wondering what and you know, wondering what people were thinking. And since once I started doing that, it got easier. But I mean, it is enormously rewarding and all that sort of thing.
Mm.
But it also is with you all the time. You know, it's not a 9-to-5 job. I mean, every day well, 6 days a week you're conducting the choir service, and you want it to be good because you know, there might be a religious reason why you want it to be good. You want it to be good professionally. You want it to be good for the sake of the youngsters. You want it to be good for the sake of your reputation, because there are people. I mean, yesterday we had a service in the chapel, and present in the congregation were at least half a dozen very distinguished retired church musicians. David Wilcox, the chief among them. And you think, well, you know, these people really know what they're listening to. And, you know, so that's stimulating. I hope it keeps me up to the mark, but it also means that it's something that's always with you.
Mm.
Always. So when I wake up on a Monday morning and I know there's no service at the end of the day, that's a different feeling.
Mm. Are there special difficulties in creating music in that building?
Well, of course, there's the acoustic of the building, which is both beautiful but also very resonant, and therefore the chief challenge is to try and achieve a clarity of texture, because I love music to be clear texture so that I can hear as much as I can.
Mm.
But I think I would say that I've become more and more, over the years that I've been doing it, I think two things have become more important in my thinking. I mean, let's assume that the musical, you know, the technical musical side is okay.
Mm.
There is the question of motivation and the psychological approach to the members of the choir. I mean, here are people who, at the deepest level, and particularly among the choral scholars, I mean, among the boys it's different because they've come for a variety of different reasons. Some of them have come because they wanted to, some of them have come because their parents sent them, and so on and so forth. But with the choral scholars, I mean, a young man of 17, for him to say, yes, I want to go to King's and I want to spend 20 hours a week singing, and I want to be submitted, and I'm prepared to be submitted to this level of discipline. I mean, that's a very, very big commitment. And when they've got other pressures on their life, and they've got directors of studies breathing down their necks and academic commitments, and they want naturally to have a social life and all that kind of thing, it would be idle to pretend that there were not days when some of them needed a bit of motivating. So I've come to realise the importance of how one approaches the thing from a psychological point of view. And I've also come to realise the extent to which what I do with and for these youngsters, for better or worse, is going to be very formative for them. So that increases my sense of responsibility, and also as I get older and, you know, start to contemplate not doing it myself, I feel that there's perhaps a value in what I'm doing in trying to hand on the torch to the next generation. So therefore the importance of the teaching element in it becomes more forward in my mind.
You may not be able to compare them, but you do different kinds of musical. You conduct, you play the organ, you teach the choir, and is there an order of enjoyment or preference in these?
Well, I enjoy nearly all of it. I mean, you're right to say I do a lot of different things. I mean, I work with the choir here, and that's the centre of my work. I also work with professional singers and players in some of the work I do in London, or people who come here, and I also work with amateurs through, say, the Comes Chorus and the student orchestra. I would say the aim is the same in each case, namely to produce the best that you can with the material you have. I say that because, you know, people are not machines, and for me, provided somebody's motivated and trying to do his best, and then I can help them perhaps do it better, that's fine. I mean, you can't expect somebody to do what he can't do. But the way you arrive at getting the best is slightly different, obviously, with children and amateurs and professionals. And with professionals, I think, or my approach is to try to be efficient and well organised and create a framework in which they can exercise their professional skill. And obviously somebody has to decide what speed the music's going at and how loud it's going to be, and they need certain guidance, but then you want to, insofar as it's practicable, you want to have them exercising their professional skill. With children, and an important thing to do is not to patronise them, because they're actually a lot brighter and a lot quicker than adults generally give them credit for. And they're actually very self-critical and very, very quick to spot. You know, a chorister will very quickly spot if there's a chorus scholar not pulling his weight. You know, there are no spots on them. And with the young chorus scholars, who in some cases are apt to think, and understandably, that they're quite good at what they're doing, or not good at it. They've been told at their school they were very good and they could try for the chorus scholars and kings. You need both to affirm them in the belief that they're good, but also to make sure they understand that they haven't yet arrived at the top of them. I mean, it must be exactly the same in undergraduate teaching, but I mean, so those are some of the variety of experience. And you mentioned organ playing. I do still play the organ, less than I used to, and therefore I have to work harder when I have a project, because, I mean, you're never so fluent. I remember having a scholarship to go and study abroad when I was younger, and I went and lived in a house on my own, or a room in my own in Germany, and had the opportunity to practice 8 hours a day for 3 weeks. I've never been so fluent, ever. And I sometimes look with envy upon organ recitalists who just do that, so they only have to play. They don't have to go and rehearse the choristers or attend college meetings or write emails particularly, and they can just do that. But the reason I enjoy playing the organ is that, as I've said, you know, I spend quite a lot of my time working out how to motivate other people. So that's very much give, give, give. And if I'm just on my own playing the organ, then I'm motivating myself. And I'm actually much stricter with myself than with other people. Not necessarily with greater end results, but and it also means that I'm subjecting myself to the sort of disciplines that I'm requiring of my organ scholars or the choral scholars, in other words, to do a really good and accurate job. So all in their different ways to enjoy.
Do you compose?
Not really. I once remember, I think it was Douglas Guest said this to me. I think I asked him that question. He said there's quite enough bad music around, and he added to it. I do compose a bit, but I don't have any creative, any seriously creative ability in that area. I do arrangements. I've done quite a lot of carol arrangements.
Yes.
So I think I'm quite good at that, and I'm quite good at that because I was given a really good grounding in it at school and in the tripos. I'm rather old-fashioned in my beliefs as to what ought to be taught to young musicians, because I think composers who have a natural gift to creativity, they're going to be fine anyway. But people like me who are going to arrange things and that sort of thing have to be musically literate.
How would you, I mean, I've heard many very good things about the choir since you've been here. How would you rate our choir in terms of other choirs either in Cambridge, Europe, the world?
I find that almost impossible.
It's one of the best choirs.
Because, well, it has a reputation of being within its genre.
One of the best.
One of those choirs, yes. It's very difficult because you're very close to it. It's like watching a child grow up really day to day. You don't notice. So somebody who sees a child after 6 months says, "Oh, haven't you grown?" I think I'm too close to it to know really. And I don't have enough time to listen to other choirs. I ought to make more time to do that. I suppose I don't particularly enjoy it because I either think they're better, in which case it makes me a bit depressed, or I think they're not as good, in which case I don't especially enjoy it.
Well, talking about listening to music, all the discussion has been about the Western classical tradition. Are there any other kinds of music, either other civilizations or other genre in the West which you enjoy?
No, I'm terribly limited. I couldn't pretend that was the case. And the justification or the excuse I give for that.
Not even jazz or pop music?
Well, I enjoy listening to jazz and certain kinds of lighter music, but I don't know anything about it. And the fact of the matter is, and this is you may think this is just an excuse, but there's so much classical music that I don't know that in the span allotted to me, I'd love to have time to get to know that more, because I think it's an interesting thing that, if I could put it this way, that music lovers, in the amateurs of music in the literal sense, often know more music than a professional, because if I'm going to give a performance of, say, the Bach Passacaglia on the organ, I'd have to spend hours practicing that, during which time you could have listened to the entire string quartets of Bartok 6 times or something. So there's a sense almost in which we don't have enough time to listen to music, and that's regrettable. I'm quite envious of people. One of my relatives, in fact my uncle, my father's sister's widower now he is, has a note. He listens to Radio 3 most of the time when he was in, and writes notes, and I go and see him and he'll say, oh, did you hear Martinet's Fifth Symphony or something? I said, no, never heard.
Do you do, how much of the sort of things that other academics do, like lecturing, supervising, PhDs, undergraduate supervisions, do you do?
Not very much at all. I mean, the history of this is that when David Wilcox and George Guest were in charge of the choirs at King's and St John's, they were employed as university lecturers, and they drew a stipend as university lecturer and ran the choir for peanuts. And it gradually became clear that as the choirs became more and more active and more central in terms of what they were doing, that this was an anomaly. So to cut a very long story short, by the time I arrived here, the link between a university lectureship and the director of music job at King's was severed. So I'm paid by the college, not by the faculty. And there's nothing in my contract which requires me to do any teaching at all. I have, however, all the time I've been here, taught the first year musicians for their harmony counterpoint. And I've done that for a number of reasons. One, I quite enjoy it. Two, it means I meet the students, the music students, in their first year, which means I know them for the rest of the time they're in college. And I do have a responsibility, a general responsibility in the college to oversee student music making activities. So
are you a director of studies?
No, I'm not. No. And indeed that link is also severed. So as I say, I do this supervising, and another reason that I do it is that I think I find it useful, and I think, I don't know whether others do, but I find it useful to feel that I'm, even at a rather minimal level, engaged in doing what the majority of my colleagues are doing. And I've always tried very hard not to give the impression that the chapel is some separate organisation that's running on a separate track away from the college. And I think the integration of the two is very important.
Well, that actually takes me on to the next question, which is about the college. How much and in what ways do you feel part of the fellowship of the college, and do you have any particular friends or people you've got on well with over the years, apart from Bernard Williams?
Well, I think the college is a great place. It's been a great stimulus to me, because I mean, I could have found myself working as a cathedral organist and living in a close. I mean, it would be very nice, to have a tied house and live on the job and not be a commuter. I'd say it's quite a heavy load when you're here 7 days a week. But the college doesn't see fit to do that. Nevertheless, I think what I gain by being here rather than in a cathedral is the ability to meet and talk to people such as yourself and other colleagues who are working in other fields, and I found that very stimulating, and many of them are in fact intensely interested in music, so that's been a point of contact. And I think also there's a sense in which I enjoy being part of a community. I mean, another option I could have had would be to try and make a freelance career, which perhaps I could have done. But I think that I actually rather enjoy being part of a community, and I have at various points sat on college committees. I even did a spell on the council, so I feel I've done a bit of a stint in a collegial sort of way, and so that's been very much a plus.
Are there any fellows over the years who have become deeper than just colleagues?
I'm not very good on friends. I don't have many close friends. But there are people
who you're glad to see around?
Glad to see around, and whom I've been glad to talk to. I mean, Tony Tanner was one. It's difficult to name because one may be forgetting people. Wynne Godley, when he was around, used to like to talk to me about music. I mean, the thing is, the rather, well, it's not dispiriting because it's nice in a way, but I mean, people are able to talk to me about music in a way which very often I'm not capable of talking to them about. I mean, I couldn't go and hold a conversation about physics really very easily, but a physicist can often talk to me about music. So I mean, I'm lucky in that position. But my musical colleagues I've got on very well with. Ian Fenton has been a great, I would say a great friend and supporter. Nick Marston. And at the moment we have extremely cordial relationships in the chapel.
With
the
Dean.
I'm sure I'm forgetting people.
My next door neighbour, the Dean.
Yes, indeed. I mean, if anybody, if any of my organist colleagues knew the setup we have here with Ian and Richard, they would be very envious.
You mentioned
but Pat Bateson.
He
was a great
supporter as well.
Because one needs this as well. You need, we all need affirmation of the right kind.
Like you, I've gone through phases. At one time it was Bach, and then it was Mozart, and now it's Handel.
Right.
I noticed that you made a recording of the Messiah, among many recordings. But tell me what your feelings for Handel are.
Well, I think Handel's a wonderful composer. Like many composers, in some ways his most popular pieces don't actually reveal the real truth. I mean, so a lot of people would know The Arrival of the Queen of Sheba or the so-called Largo from Xerxes. But I think the thing about Handel, one of the things about him, is that although his music in a sense can be easily imitated and was imitated by contemporaries, there's something about him, I think that this is what marks out any great composer, is that there's a sense of imagination there that makes that music unique. And I think even a work as frequently performed as Messiah, if you can sort of get into it almost as if you're experiencing it for the first time, it's just an astonishing creation. Although Messiah, again, is one of the least typical of his works, because most of his oratorios, most of his big choral works, I should say, are oratorios based on Old Testament subjects. And here he is writing something about the whole of the Christian year, I mean, starting with Advent and going right through to dealing with the passages from the book of Revelation. But a work like Israel in Egypt, for example, is immensely powerful. And there's one where he's talking about in the early passages, there are amazing depictions of the plague and locusts.
And he catches it in the music, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And then there's a wonderful one about darkness. And the expression is, a darkness which can be felt. Well, apart from the fact that's a beautiful poetic image, before you think about any music, the way he depicts this in the music, which I can't think of words quite to describe, is astonishing. And his ear for sonority and textures, it's mind-boggling, really.
When he sets, you talked about darkness, he sets Samson.
Yes.
Samson, I think so. Anyway,
Yes,
Milton, dark
yes.
amidst the blaze of noon, or
Yes.
whatever. Absolutely.
Oh, it is quite incredible, and often it's achieved by rather simple means, which are, in a sense, deceptive.
Often with a gap between bits of music,
Yes.
just suddenly.
And silences and changes of texture. No, it's amazing.
No, I just listen to him every day if I can.
Marvellous. I knew somebody once, a clergyman, who was Dean of King's London. He was a remarkable man called Ulrich Siebel. His family had come to, I think they'd been refugees from Germany in the 30s, and he converted to Christianity and became an Anglican priest. He told me that he and his wife began each day listening to a Bach cantata.
I end each day, for a very long time, listening to a Handel aria.
Isn't that wonderful?
I recorded 100 of them onto my iPod and
Right.
listened each evening to one. And I often write to them. I mean, I really want to be inspired. I listen to some Handel and then I start writing. And I just overwhelmed. And to write the Messiah in such a... Is that unusual, in 2 weeks or whatever it was?
Well, of course in those days, and Bach did this as well, they tended to self-plagiarise to some extent.
Yes,
I mean, so they borrowed stuff that they'd already written.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of the B minor mass of Bach is simply carved from other things, but it's quite interesting to study those processes as well. So there wasn't that, people would think that was an awful thing to do. No. But I mean, he must have had extraordinary fluency. I mean, I just can't begin to fathom it really. Whereas other composers, I mean, Beethoven, of course, worked with much greater difficulty. And there are sketchbooks that one can look at and see that what must have been a very painful process. And it must, presumably it's the same, though I don't have detailed knowledge, it must be the same for writers and painters. Some can just do it.
Yes.
For others, it's a slow and painful process.
Do you know the musical criticism of Samuel Butler at all?
I don't.
You know of Samuel Butler, I mean L1 and so on, but he was apparently, in his day, one of the greatest music critics.
Right.
And there's a lovely bit in his notebooks, if you look at Samuel Butler's notebooks, where he says, I have fought against this, accepting this realization all my life, because I didn't want to face it, but I now have to admit that Handel is the greatest of all composers. And he then, either he or someone else, quotes Beethoven, who was asked who was his greatest predecessor. He said undoubtedly Handel.
Oh, yes.
And that he'd written more music than Bach and Mozart put together.
Yes.
Huge output.
Yes.
Anyway, enough of my...
Yes, there we are. No, very interesting.
Is there anything else that you would like to
Well,
mention?
to say, I mean, I'm feeling a little bit sort of tired from that. I'm not sure my brain will sort of call up what I mean, were there things you'd hoped you could talk about, or the...
No, we've talked about the main things: politics, religion, music. But I don't want people to go away saying, why didn't he ask me about
I
this?
don't think I'm thinking that at the moment. I might by the time I get home tonight.
Well, let's stop there. If you do, we can always do another 10 minutes.